4. Historical Materialism. Proudhon entitled his book, The System of Economic Contradictions, with the subtitle, The Philosophy of Poverty, and Marx therefore entitled his reply, The Poverty of Philosophy, and he wrote it in French in order to hit his opponent still more certainly. As a matter of fact, Marx did not succeed, for Proudhon's influence on the French working class and on the proletariat of the Latin countries in general rose rather than fell. And for many decades Marx had still to contend with Proudhonism. However, neither the immediate value of his reply nor its historical significance was diminished thereby. It represented a milestone both in the life of its author and in the history of social science. In this book the decisive factors of historical materialism were scientifically developed for the first time. In his earlier writings these ideas flash up like isolated comets, and in later writings he collected them in epigrammatic form. But in his reply to Proudhon he developed them systematically with all the convincing clarity of a triumphant polemic. The greatest scientific service rendered by Marx was his development of historical materialism, and it did for the historical sciences what Darwin's theories did for the natural sciences. Engels had a share in this, and it was a larger share than his modesty was prepared to admit, but the classic formulation of the basic idea he ascribes, and probably with justice, exclusively to his friend. He describes how, when he went to Brussels in the spring of 1845, Marx placed the basic idea of historical materialism before him in its finely developed form, namely, that economic production in each historical period, and the social structure necessarily following from it, formed the basis for the political and intellectual history of the period. That in consequence the whole of history had been a history of class struggles between the exploited and the exploiters, and between the ruled and the ruling classes at various stages of social development, and that these struggles had now reached a stage at which the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, could no longer free itself from the exploiting and oppressing class, the bourgeoisie, without at the same time freeing the whole of society from exploitation and oppression forever. This is the basic idea presented in the reply to Proudhon, the focal point from which a multitude of rays irradiate. The style of the reply is magnificently clear and incisive, in strong contrast to the discursiveness which sometimes tires the reader in the polemics against Bruno Bauer and Max Stirner. This time the vessel is not being pushed and dragged along through a marsh, but speeds along over the open sea with a fresh breeze in its sails. The book is in two parts. In the first part, to quote Lassalle, Marx shows himself as a Ricardo-turned-socialist, and in the second part as a Hegel-turned-economist. Ricardo had proved that the exchange of commodities in capitalist society took place on the basis of the amount of labor spent on them. Proudhon demanded that this value of commodities should be constituted so that the product of one producer should exchange with the product of another containing the same amount of labor. Society was to be reformed by turning all its members into workers exchanging similar quantities of labor. English socialists had already drawn this egalitarian conclusion from Ricardo's theory and had attempted to put it into practice, but their exchange banks had soon gone into liquidation. Marx now pointed out that the revolutionary theory which Proudhon thought he had discovered to emancipate the proletariat was in fact nothing but the formula of modern working-class slavery. On the basis of his law of value, Ricardo logically developed his law of wages. The value of labor as a commodity was determined by the amount of time necessary to obtain the products which the worker needs in order to live himself and perpetuate his kind. It was a bourgeois illusion to imagine individual exchange without class contradictions, and to suppose in bourgeois society the possibility of a state of harmony and eternal justice permitting no one to enrich himself at the cost of others. Marx describes the real development of things in these words. With the beginning of civilization, production begins to rise, based on the contrast of occupation, social position, and finally on the contrast of accumulated and direct labor. Without contrast there can be no progress. Civilization has acknowledged this law down to the present day. Up to the present the productive forces have been developed on the basis of this dominance of class contradiction. With his theory of constituted value, Proudhon sought to secure for the worker the ever-increasing product of everyday labor resulting from the progress of social labor. But Marx pointed out that the development of the productive forces which permitted the English workers to produce 27 times more in 1840 than in 1770 depended on historical conditions based on class contradictions, the accumulation of private capital, the modern division of labor, anarchic competition and the wage system. For the production of surplus labor there must be a class which profited and a class which lost, Proudhon put forward gold and silver as the first examples of his constituted value, declaring that they had become money from their sovereign consecration at the hands of sovereigns. "Nothing of the sort," answered Marx. Money was not a thing in itself but a social relation and, like individual exchange, it reflected a certain definite mode of production. Indeed, an utter ignorance of history is necessary in order not to know that at all times sovereign rulers have had to submit to economic conditions and have never been able to dictate laws to them. Both political and civil legislation do no more than recognize and record the will of economic conditions. Law is nothing but the recognition of fact. The sovereign seal on money gave it its weight and not its value. Gold and silver fitted to constituted value about as comfortably as a blister. Precisely in their function as tokens of value they were of all commodities the only ones not determined by their costs of production, and could be replaced in circulation by paper money. As Ricardo had long since made clear, Marx hinted at the final aim of communism by pointing out that the correct balance between supply and demand for which Proudhon was looking had been possible only in times when the means of production were limited, when exchange took place within very narrow boundaries, when demand governed supply and consumption governed production. With the development of large-scale industry this had become impossible because industry was compelled by its tools alone to produce in steadily increasing quantities without waiting for demand, and must therefore experience with inevitable necessity and in constant succession the phases of prosperity and depression, crisis and stagnation, new prosperity and so on. In present-day society, in industry which is based on individual exchange, productive anarchy, which is the source of so much evil, is at the same time the cause of all progress. Therefore the alternatives are: 1. Either strives to obtain the correct proportions of former centuries with the means of production of our own day, in which case one is both reactionary and utopian. Or one must strive for progress without anarchy, in which case one must abandon individual exchange in order to maintain the productive forces. The second chapter of Marx's reply to Proudhon is even more important than the first. In the first chapter he deals with Ricardo without as yet having won through to complete scientific objectivity towards him. For instance, he still accepts Ricardo's law of wages without reservation. But in the second chapter he deals with Hegel, and there he is in his element. Proudhon had grossly misunderstood Hegel's dialectical method. He held fast to those aspects which had already become reactionary, for instance, that the world of reality is derived from the world of ideas, whilst he rejected its revolutionary aspect, the auto-activity of the idea, which formulates both thesis and antithesis in order to develop in the conflict that higher unity which maintains the real content of both aspects by resolving their contradictory forms. He differentiated a good and a bad side in each economic category and then sought for a synthesis, for a scientific formula which would embody the good side and destroy the bad. The good side he saw stressed by the bourgeois economists and the bad side condemned by the socialists. With his formulas and syntheses he thought he raised himself above both the bourgeois economists and the socialists. Marx answered this claim in the words, "Monsieur Proudhon flatters himself that he has criticized both economics and communism, but in reality he has remained far below either of them. Below the economist because as a philosopher with a magic formula in his pocket he imagines himself spared the necessity of going into economic details. And below the socialist because he has neither sufficient insight nor sufficient courage to raise himself, even speculatively, above the bourgeois horizon. He aspires to be the synthesis and he is in fact nothing but a composite error. He desires to hover above both bourgeois and proletarian as a man of science, but in fact he is nothing but a petty bourgeois thrown hither and thither between capital and labor, between economics and socialism. However, one must not confuse the petty bourgeois here with the Philistine, for Marx always regarded Proudhon as a capable man unfortunately unable to go beyond the limits of petty bourgeois society. It was not difficult for Marx to reveal the defectiveness of the methods adopted by Proudhon. If one split up the dialectical process into a good and a bad side and offered the one category as an antidote against the other, then all life fled from the idea. It could no longer function, no longer formulate the thesis and the antithesis. As an authentic student of Hegel, Marx was well aware that the bad side which Proudhon was so anxious to abolish everywhere was just the side which made history by producing the struggle. Had one tried to maintain the better aspects of feudalism, the patriarchal life in the towns, the prosperity of the rural domestic industry and the development of urban handicraft, whilst at the same time seeking to exterminate everything which cast a shadow over the picture, serfdom, privilege and anarchy, then everything which produced the struggle would have been wiped out and the bourgeoisie would have been strangled at birth. One would thereby have taken on the grotesque task of emasculating history. The correct formulation of the problem was given by Marx in the following words. If one wishes to estimate feudal production correctly, one must regard it as a mode of production based on contradiction. One must show how riches were produced within this contradiction, how the productive forces developed simultaneously with the struggle of the classes, and how one of these classes, the bad side, the social evil, grew ceaselessly until the material conditions for its emancipation had ripened. And he then showed the same historical process of development in connection with the bourgeoisie. The productive relations in which it moves have no simple and uniform character, but a double one. Misery is produced under the same conditions as riches. As the bourgeoisie develops, so the proletariat develops to the same degree, and, as a result, the struggle between the two classes. The economists are the theorists of the bourgeoisie, whilst the communists and socialists are the theorists of the proletariat. The latter are utopians who draw up systems and seek for scientific remedies to meet the needs of the oppressed classes, as long as the proletariat is not sufficiently developed to constitute itself a class, and as long as the productive forces of bourgeois society are not developed sufficiently to reveal the material conditions necessary for the emancipation of the proletariat and the building up of a new society. But to the extent to which history advances, and with it the struggle of the proletariat, it is no longer necessary for them to seek science in their heads. All they need do is give themselves an account of what is going on before their eyes and make themselves its instruments. While they are still seeking science in their heads and drawing up systems, while they are only at the beginning of their struggle, they see only misery in misery, and fail to realize the revolutionary side of misery which will overthrow the old society. From this moment on, science becomes the conscious product of the historical movement. It has ceased to be doctrinaire and has become revolutionary. Marx regards economic categories as nothing but the theoretical expression, the abstraction of social relations. Social relations are closely connected with the productive forces. With the attainment of new productive forces, mankind alters its mode of production. With the way in which it obtains its living, mankind alters all its social relations, but the same men who form their social relations in accordance with their material mode of production, form also their principles, their ideas and their categories in accordance with their social relations. Marx compares the bourgeois economists who speak of the eternal and natural institutions of bourgeois society with those orthodox theologians who consider their own religion a revelation from God and all other religions as the inventions of man. Marx revealed the defectiveness of Proudhon's methods on the basis of a number of economic categories with which the latter had experimented. The division of labor and the machine, competition and monopoly, land ownership and rent, strikes and workers' organizations. The division of labor was not, as Proudhon assumed, an economic category, but a historical category, which had taken on various forms in various periods of history. According to bourgeois economics, the factory is the condition for the existence of the division of labor, but the factory did not originate, as Proudhon assumed, as the result of friendly agreement amongst the workers and not even in the lap of the old guilds. The merchant became the head of the modern workshop and not the old guild master. Competition and monopoly are thus not natural, but social categories. Competition is not industrial, but commercial zeal. It is not concerned with the product, but with profit. It is not a necessity of the human soul, as Proudhon assumed, but the result of historical necessity originating in the 18th century, and it could disappear in the 19th century for historical reasons. Proudhon's idea that landed property had no historical origin, that it was based on psychological and moral considerations having only a very distant connection with the production of wealth, that ground rent should bind man closer to nature, was just as erroneous. In every period property developed differently and under quite different social relations. To explain bourgeois property therefore means nothing more than to explain all the social relations of bourgeois production. To explain property as an independent relation is nothing but an illusion of metaphysics or jurisprudence. Ground rent, the surplus of the price of agricultural produce above the cost of production, including the prevailing rate of profit on capital and the interest on capital, originated under definite social relations and could have originated only under those definite social relations. It is land ownership in its bourgeois form, feudal property subjected to the conditions of bourgeois production, and finally Marx explains the historic significance of strikes and unions, both of which Proudhon rejected. Although both bourgeois economists and socialists may warn the workers, though perhaps for opposite reasons, against the use of such weapons, strikes and unions will develop parallel with the development of large-scale industry. Divided in their interests by competition, the workers have nevertheless a common interest in maintaining their wages. The idea of resistance, common to them all, united them in unions which contain all the elements of a coming struggle. Just as the bourgeoisie began with sectional combinations against the feudal lords, then constituted itself as a class and, as a constituted class, transformed feudal society into bourgeois society. The antagonism between proletariat and bourgeoisie is a struggle of class against class, a struggle which, brought to its highest expression, means a complete revolution. The social movement does not exclude the political movement because there is no political movement which is not at the same time a social movement. Only in a society without classes will social evolution cease to be political revolution. But until then the last word of social science on the eve of all general social transformations will always be, victory or death, bloody war or nothing. This is the pitiless formulation of the question. Marx used this quotation from George Sand to conclude his reply to Proudhon. In this book Marx developed historical materialism from some of its most important angles, and at the same time he finally settled accounts with German philosophy. He went beyond Feuerbach by going back to Hegel. The official Hegelian school had certainly gone bankrupt. It had degenerated the dialectical methods of its master to a mere formula which it applied to everything and everybody, often with the greatest clumsiness. One could say of these Hegelians, and it was said of them, that they understood nothing and wrote about everything. Their hour had struck when Feuerbach challenged the speculative conception. The positive content of science once again outweighed its formal side, but the materialism of Feuerbach lacked an energizing principle. It remained pure natural science and excluded the historical process. This was not enough for Marx, and how right he was seen later when the peripatetic preachers of this materialism, Buchner and Voigt, appeared on the scene. Their narrow-minded Philistine methods of thought caused even Feuerbach to exclaim that though he might agree with such materialism from behind, yet never would he from the front. Or, to quote a comparison once used by Engels, the stiff-kneed cart-horse of bourgeois common sense naturally shies at the ditch which separates essence from appearance and cause from effect. But if one wants to hunt over the broken country of abstract thought, one must not ride a cart-horse. However, the Hegelians were not Hegel. They might display their ignorance, but Hegel himself was amongst the best brains of all time. Far more than all other philosophers, his method of thought had a historic significance which permitted him a magnificent conception of history. Although this conception was a purely ideological one which saw things, so to speak, in a concave mirror and conceived world history as no more than a practical example of the development of thought. Feuerbach had not succeeded in coping with this real content of the Hegelian philosophy, and the orthodox Hegelians had abandoned it. Marx took it up anew, but he reversed it in that he no longer proceeded from pure thought, but from the stubborn facts of reality, thus giving materialism the historical dialectical method and an energizing principle which sought not merely to explain society, but to transform it.